My name is Mark Laframboise. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose, and on behalf of our staff and our owners, it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. Over the course of his working life, Tom Dyja has held many jobs in the book world. He's been a bookseller, an editor, a book packager, and along the way, he's written 3 novels, Play for a Kingdom, Meet John Trow, and The Moon in Our Hands, as well as a biography of civil rights leader Walter White. Tonight, we're fortunate to have Tom here to talk about his new book, The Third Coast, When Chicago Built the American Dream, his sweeping synthesis of post-war cultural history, the original subtitle, in the Windy City. From Mies van der Rohe and the Bauhaus architects who fled Europe and made their home at IIT, to Southern bluesmen Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, who came to Chicago to record at Chess Records. From Nelson Algren and Gwendolyn Brooks, who were forging very different but distinct local literary culture, to the advent of modern media, television and magazines, Tom weaves these unique threads into a fascinating whole. At the same time, though, he's telling the story of a city and its citizens at a remarkable point in history, a story rich with heroes and villains. Thanks for coming, and help me welcome Tom Dyja.
So thank you all for coming tonight. I'm going to take I don't have my right glasses with me. Before anything else, let me thank Mark Laframboise, who left off the part that he and I went to high school together in Chicago, and gave me he is one of the greatest readers in the book business. He's famously so, and he gave me some wonderful thoughts on this book as well. So if it's any good, Mark has a hand in that. So thank you, sir. Given that Chicago is known to be a no-nonsense kind of town, let's get right to the chase here. Why exactly should you care about Chicago? 60 years ago, everybody knew the answer to this question. Chicago's location in the middle of America made it central to the national consciousness, central to its business, its agriculture, its industry. It was the original Las Vegas, kind of America's party central. Between 1932 and 1960, 9 out of the 16 political conventions were held in Chicago. It had strippers, it had gambling, it had Marshall Fields, it had all those great French paintings at the Art Institute. Even if you didn't want to stop in Chicago, a trip across America all but required one if you were traveling by train. In fact, it was required by law. You could fly coast to coast, but it was expensive and it was not terribly comfortable. But all of that changed on the morning of January 25th, 1959. American Airlines Flight number 2, a Boeing 707, took off from Los Angeles and landed about 4 hours later at Idlewild Airport, and this marked the beginning of regular nonstop commercial jet service between the coasts, and it was the start of the bicoastal mentality, I think. It was also the end of a very unique period in Chicago, and the Third Coast is a history of the 20 or so years that lead up to that flight. These years were, I think, to me, Chicago's greatest and its final period as the nation's primary meeting place, market, workshop, factory, and lab. Beginning in the late 30s and rolling on through the 1950s, Chicagoans produced a surprising number of the things by which the world defines the word American. So tonight I'd like to kind of explain 10 ways that the Third Coast Chicago has affected your life, whether you know it or not. Number 1, Mies van der Rohe. Mies was the last director of the Bauhaus Design School in Germany. When he finds himself on the outs with the Nazis in 1938, he moves to Chicago to run the IIT School of Architecture and redesign the campus on the near south side. In buildings like 860, 880 Lakeshore Drive, a pair of beautiful 26-story apartment buildings, the Farnsworth House in Plano, a one-story small home built for a spinster doctor. These are strong, simple buildings made of steel and glass. And through them, Mies expresses what he thinks are the possibilities of what post-war America can be, something powerful, very rigorously thought out, and posh. Mies loved really nice materials. So while there were, of course, other modern architects working at this time, Le Corbusier, Neumayer, all these people, Mies is the man who is most responsible for spreading this simple and very cost-effective style of architecture that becomes the face of big business and big government, and therefore the face of the American skyline. So if you're living in any kind of American city, you are probably surrounded by the influence of Mies van der Rohe. Number 2, Chicago music. First, there's Leonard Chess, who with his brother Phil records some of the biggest names in rock and roll, blues, jazz, gospel at their label Chess Records. In the early 50s, they record Muddy Waters, who'd come up from Mississippi in 46 and revolutionizes the blues when he trades his acoustic guitar for an electric one. He creates this new, harder edge sound that really expresses the way that the southern black migrants coming up experience their new home in the north, which is a place where it actually snows occasionally, and L trains and skyscrapers. Other great chess bluesmen from this time, Howlin' Wolf, Little Walter, Willie Dixon. Little Walter does basically the same thing with the harmonica. He plays with it to kind of put an edge on it. In the late 50s, after rock and roll comes up and kind of pushes the blues onto a side railing, a lot of these bluesmen, led by Muddy, go to England. And while they're there, a whole generation of young fans go and wait in line to see them. Young fans like Eric Clapton and Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney. So and out of them comes the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds. Rock and rock, as you know it, really happens because of Muddy Waters and the Chicago Bluesmen. Chess had another more direct influence on rock and roll. In the spring of 1955, Leonard and Phil record two then unknown guitarists, Bo Diddley and Chuck Berry, whose first big songs, Bo Diddley and Chuck Berry's Maybelline, really propel early rock and roll forward. If Leonard Chess hadn't have really ticked off Sam Phillips, the famous producer in Memphis, he actually would have gotten Elvis Presley as well. Reverend C.L. Franklin in Detroit distributed his recorded sermons through Chess, which convinced them to let them record his young daughter Aretha with her first album of gospel music. There was more than just chess in Chicago. Gospel music started in Chicago. Mahalia Jackson came up in the late 20s from New Orleans as a teenager, and she had this ecstatic singing style that really scandalized the old school black churches in Chicago, but over time would eventually be picked up by R&B performers like Ray Charles. And after that, actually funk music avowedly draws an influence from gospel music. Gospel purists argue whether Mahalia was in fact the greatest gospel singer ever, but what she definitely brought to the table was that she brought gospel and, more importantly, this black presence that could not in any way be demeaned in the 50s into the white mainstream. She was very popular on television variety shows. Anyway, she also became a political player who was very friendly with both Reverend Martin Luther King, sang at the March on Washington, but also Mayor Richard J. Daley, who had her back as well. Strange combination. Finally, there's Herman Blount was the man's name, who was born in Birmingham, moves up after the war after claiming to have been visited by aliens. In Chicago, he kind of holds himself up in a little apartment, studies strange esoteric Egyptian philosophy and all kinds of Gnostic wisdom, and along the way changes his name to Sun Ra. He creates a little band called the Orchestra, and he leads them through hours and weeks of practice, which involves not even, they go beyond the notes, they go beyond sheet music, they go beyond names of their songs, and it takes jazz past bebop, which is very popular at this point of breaking out, into the avant-garde, and in a way that the music becomes almost spiritual. And actually, this is what helps get John Coltrane, the famous saxophonist who at this point is a big junkie. It's Sun Ra who really gets him cleaned up and pushed towards his sheets of sound approach. Philosophically, Sun Ra had another influence in that Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam were coming into prominence on the south side of Chicago, and Sun Ra and the Nation of Islam people sometimes interacted, let's just say, in Washington Park there. So it's another strange impact of Chicago music. Number three, though Chicago's role by this point in the mid-50s as meatpacker to the world has ended, the slaughterhouses have closed, meatpacking is closed, Ray Kroc starts another kind of food revolution out of Chicago. And it's one that helps make America forget that food is actually a part of the natural world. Kroc had served in World War I in an ambulance corps with Walt Disney, another Chicagoan for a while, and then does things like sell swampland in the Everglades, play piano with a snifter, bounces around the paper cup business, always looking for this big hit. And then finally in 1954, he goes to San Bernardino. He's selling mix masters at this point, and he meets the McDonald's brothers, who have a drive-in that is just doing crazy business. Has this little total system worked out. Every store is like, the one store is like a factory. And Kroc falls in love with this. He's a very quirky guy, very exacting, and their system plays something to him. So he makes a deal where he will franchise this and basically almost give them everything. He just wants to be the kind of John the Baptist of McDonald's. He is a quirky but actually fair entrepreneur. And he wants to offer to people at this point when gray flannel suits and corporatism are really overtaking America, wants to give them a chance to own their own small business, but then realize all those economies of scale that you get with a big business. He was, surprisingly enough, devoted to high quality ingredients and ethical business. At this time, if you went into a fast food joint, there might be, of course, who knows what's in it now, but theoretically it's supposed to be good, right? At the time, there'd maybe be a hole in the middle of your hamburger if you picked up the bun, or chicken organs ground into the meat. It was all kind of gross. And Kroc was very clear about high quality stuff, no rancid shortening, things like that. So while McDonald's now stands in the minds of many people for everything that's awful about America, at the time, in 1955, McDonald's and Ray Kroc were all about quality, creativity, independence, and actually small is beautiful. Number 4. During this period, it's hard to believe, before the arrival of Robert Maynard Hutchins in 1929, the University of Chicago was essentially regarded as a frat school that cared about nothing but football, not at all about academics. Through the 30s, Hutchins turns the school into a kind of intellectual hothouse. After the war, it produces people from Kurt Vonnegut to Bob Silvers, who's the editor of the New York Review of Books now, Susan Sontag. Nuclear fission. At the same time, University of Chicago Press publishes Frederick Hayek's Road to Serfdom and Saul Alinsky's Reveille for Radicals, which, if you have both of those on your shelf, good for you. Great books, the Encyclopedia Britannica, all these things are coming out of Hyde Park during these years. The other great export of Hyde Park during this period, though, a little post-Hutchins, in 1955, a young New York exile named David Shepard and his friend Paul Sill started a little theater company called the Compass Theater. And it's a cabaret that is influenced not just by Brecht, but by a series of improvised children's theater games that Sill's mother, Viola Spolin, created when she was working for the WPA. Instead of acting the performers, whether they're kids or whether they're in the Compass, they made up their dialogue on the spot to carry through different situations. And the immediacy of this, the kind of the sport of almost playing on the stage as opposed to delivering set lines, kind of lives on. The Compass lasts for maybe a year and a half or so, but this idea creates new little companies. Some of the people who are in it, like Mike Nichols and Elaine May, most famously probably, Shelley Berman becomes a big stand-up comic. Finally, in 1959, Bernie Sahlins and Paul Sill open up a place called Second City on the north side. And I think it is impossible to overstate the impact that the Compass and Second City have had on American entertainment, starting with, I won't do the whole list because it's really long, but Alan Alda, Alan Arkin, Gilda Radner, the Saturday Night Live period, Bill Murray, John Belushi, John Candy, and today, Tina Fey, Stephen Carell, Stephen Colbert. So the Colbert Report actually can kind of trace its lineage all the way back to Bughouse Square in Chicago. If you laugh in Chicago, if you laugh in America, there's a good chance that you're laughing at something that can trace its way back to the Compass Theater. Number 5, speaking of television, in the late 40s, TV productions out of New York were like basically film Broadway shows or vaudeville, very expensive. LA ones kind of were working off the movie model. But they were both, like an episode of your show of shows cost something like $75,000, $80,000, and this was way too much for TV. So the network heads looked to Chicago in the same way that they had when radio came out. Basically the same thing happened. Radio shows were expensive on the coast, so they said, come up with cheap stuff. And one of the things that Chicago creative people came up with during the radio era was the soap opera. So they were hoping for something like that out of this. And what the Chicago television creatives came up with was a new kind of understanding to television. They saw that when a show was on, it wasn't just being beamed off to millions of people. At any given moment, maybe 4 or 5 people were watching a TV. And so they kind of calibrated television to a campfire. They behaved like guests in the home. At first, mostly bars had television. So puppeteer Bert Hillstrom was asked to create a show that would finally convince mom and dad that they had to buy one for the house. The result was a show called Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. It was a very gentle show, puppet show, that was, again, mostly improvised with a woman named Fran Allison, who was Dorothy in Oz, Alice in Wonderland, who kind of interacted with the Kuklapolitans. Bird did all the puppets. It was this kind of bittersweet wistfulness, dry humor. It developed very quickly a cult following, and it never beat Howdy Doody in the ratings, but Howdy Doody didn't have fans like Adlai Stevenson and Tallulah Bankhead and John Steinbeck, who all wrote impassioned letters when it got canceled. It may also have had a kind of odd impact on politics, which I will mention since we're in Washington. The the 1952 the election between Eisenhower and Stevenson was really the first major televised campaign. And Stevenson, as entertaining as it was big crash and burn, frankly. But a lot of it was because of television. Ike had these awful, if you've ever seen them, I Like Ike commercials, which look like Good and Plenty ads, kids banging drums, and they're really basic, let's just say. But they really worked. And Stevenson was terrible on television. He would go on and on and on and just kind of ramble. They'd have to cut him off in the middle of interviews because he would go past the time. And in fact, he was Kukla, Frananalli's lawyer. And he also, the director of the Kukla, Frananalli show, a guy named Louis Gomovitz, was his TV advisor. So as much as, and also Stevenson bore, I think, a tragic resemblance to Kukla, which I wish I had a picture, but in fact he did. So, Adlai Stevenson ran a Kukla Frananalli campaign, which, they were very adorable and lovable, but after a certain amount of time you wanted it to end. Dave Garroway was another big Chicago television product. He was a late-night DJ, had a show called the 1260 Club that was kind of this late-night hip cat kind of, hey, guys, And everybody at University of Chicago Northwestern listened to it. And so they gave him a variety show, very little money again. And instead of trying to whip something out of nothing, he said, let's just open up the stage. We're going to take the camera and show the boom and the cameraman and how all the special effects work. Again, the whole show is improvised. And, again, he used that warm DJ voice to kind of bring people in. And he was terrific at getting the audience to accept new singers, new things. But he also was really good at getting viewers to buy the stuff that he was selling on the show. So New York liked that a lot. Then he was snatched up, brought to the coast, and the first show he was put on was this idea someone had to put on television first thing in the morning, the Today Show. So, and that worked really well, so that spun off very quickly into the Tonight Show. So talk television is also something that really came out of a Chicago tradition. Television, as we know it, really began to understand itself as its own medium through the Chicago School of Television at this point. Number 6. Civil rights. Emmett Till grew up in Woodlawn near 63rd and Cottage Grove. In the late summer of 1955, he goes down to Mississippi to visit family, and he's lynched when he allegedly whistles at a white woman in a general store. When his body is returned to Chicago, his mother, Mamie, does something that I think is very remarkable. Rather than hide his body in shame, bury him quietly, instead she allows his photo to be published. The sight of this 14-year-old boy mangled beyond any kind of recognition, she herself compares him to like a space alien. It's remarkable. It catalyzes and unites Black America in a very emotional way that almost transcends the legal reality of Brown versus Board of Education. A few months after he's killed in early August, Rosa Parks, in that December, refuses to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery. Later, she tells Mamie Till that she was thinking of Emmett Till as she was doing it. So the martyrdom of this young man from the south side of Chicago, I think in some ways lit the fuse of what becomes the modern civil rights movement. Number 7. In 1937, another former Bauhaus instructor named Laszlo Moholy-Nagy reopens the Bauhaus on the south side of Chicago as the new Bauhaus. Mies, who is this big, hulking kind of Teutonic monk, very dramatic, it's all about top-down, big institutions, Platonic ideals. Moholy is this kind of peppy, irrepressible Hungarian. He dabbles with painting and sculpture and film and photography, and he believes that the point of art is the act of making art, not the object produced. His favorite thing to say is, everyone is talented. And not surprisingly, these two men hated each other deeply. The new Bauhaus folds in 1938. Moholy starts the School of Design, which becomes the Institute of Design, still exists today at IIT as part of the school, and it is in the basement of Mies's great Crown Hall building, which is where Mies wanted it to be, in the basement. Moholy's understanding of art as this kind of a basic human function. It's something everyone does. Tapped into the sense that Chicago had with its craft traditions as a workshop. And Moholy also understood before anyone else issues about art that would really inform art well into our current digital age. He saw that art was no longer going to be about genius and inspiration and oil painting and all that. It was going to be about perception. And the oil paints were going to give way to products of life, TV, movies, photography. He was decades ahead of Andy Warhol, Marshall McLuhan, saying the things that they miraculously come up with. Though the Institute of Design produced more educators than designers, or not a lot of famous chairs or tables that come out of it, a remarkable number of influential people passed through it during these Third Coast years and when Moholy's there. A generation of great photographers like Harry Callahan, Aaron Siskind, Arthur Siegel, graphic designers like Robert Bronjon, Ivan Chermayeff. Their firm creates the logos for Chase, Mobil, NBC, PBS. The kind of identities that we have of corporate America come out of these ID designers. Buckminster Fuller conquers the geodesic dome at the ID in 48. It even had a relationship, a lot of the people worked with, new people who worked at the store called Baldwin Kingery, which was not too far from the school, which was the first store that brought cheap, kind of, low-priced modern design from all around the world, set up little scenarios with it, and sold it to young urbanites moving downtown Chicago. It was the direct inspiration for Crate and Barrel. Number 8. Another Institute of Design photography student, a very kind of withdrawn Korean veteran named Richard Nickel, who found life through a project at the school cataloging all the Louis Sullivan buildings that are being torn down during this period. About 6,000 buildings are torn down from about 46 through 1960, and a remarkable number of them are Louis Sullivan buildings. Nickel becomes obsessed with Sullivan, and at about 1960, he leads the charge to preserve the Garrick Theater, which is this heartbreakingly beautiful theater that was across the street from the Federal Center. It fails. The building comes down, but Nickel launches the kind of effort, the grassroots landmark preservation effort that he starts is really the first one of its kind, and it really begins the ball rolling. And it, in effect, kind of puts the brakes on some of the massive urban renewal that the followers of Mies are putting forward. So if Chicago produces Mies and all this whole generation of urban planners, the architectural firm Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill becomes, out of Chicago, becomes the world's largest during this period, mostly through pushing through Mies everywhere. But the city also inspired that Nickel drive to save buildings that are of value around you. Number 9 may not have an impact on you, but I have to talk about this couple. You may not have been changed by Nelson Algren and Simone de Beauvoir, but they are kind of the great love story of this whole period in Chicago. He was the city's greatest novelist, I think, bar none. And the New Yorker called de Beauvoir, quote, the prettiest existentialist. So I don't know what the competition was for that title, but during these years, Algren writes his very best work, and ironically, while she is having this very traditional affair with Algren, because her affair and dealings with Sartre were anything but traditional, right? While she's with Algren is when she begins writing The Second Sex, which begins in Chicago. It's kind of the foundational book of feminism. Back in Paris, Algren goes to visit her when the book comes out, and all of the family, as they call themselves on the left bank, were kind of standing back and laughing as she's being attacked in the press, and Algren kind of had her back publicly and visibly in Paris, which is kind of wonderful. Their romance plays out on 2 continents, but it ends very badly for Algren, who has his heart broken by Simone, but also by Chicago in a way. His great novel, The Man with the Golden Arm, makes him a big star in 1949. But right after this, his life starts to unravel. De Beauvoir has to live in Paris. He has to be in Chicago. They're fated to never be. Simone takes this in stride. To be honest, she is pretty okay with the whole friends with benefit thing that they have. Algren is always emotionally frail. He's had nervous breakdowns in the past, and this is not good for him. He writes Chicago City on the Make, which is a wonderful thing, but it turns the city deeply against him. And when Otto Preminger makes this terrible film version of Man with the Golden Arm in 55, that's really the last straw for Algren. He tries to commit suicide. He actually never writes fiction again after this. Everything that happens in the 50s, the rise of consumer culture, the death of the Rosenbergs, the McCarthyism, the racism of Chicago, all of this over time, it steered him away from the common man that he had really started always believing in and writing for. And it really pushes him off towards the outlaws. And you can see the difference between Man with the Golden Arm and some of his later stuff like Entrapment, where the drugs are kind of cool, for lack of a better word. Simone, for her part, was buried wearing a ring he gave her. So I think the love never stopped. Last one. Number 10 is a man who, for me, in the book, I think is kind of Algren's foil. He's a lonely kid from out in my neighborhood, Belmont Cragen on the Northwest Side, and his name is Hugh Hefner. And he comes back after the war. He's a typist. He's too young, but he's a good typist, so he doesn't go into combat. Goes to the U of I on the GI Bill, falls in love with a girl, but by 1952, he has two big problems. First, he is obsessed with sex. Much, much more so than his young wife, and this is making him very, very unhappy. The second is that he's really going nowhere. Back in high school, he'd been kind of the big man on campus, had dreamt of being downtown, going to jazz clubs with the women on his arm and everything, but now he's stuck in a kind of middling magazine job. He has a small apartment in Hyde Park, a cool apartment, though, which actually got the furniture was photographed in the Daily News for being kind of a style point. But the apartment is getting smaller. His wife's just had a new baby named Christine. So after he does the Steinmetz High School reunion show, he is downtown. He's walking over the Michigan Avenue Bridge, and he just says, I'm going to do it. And he decides to push kind of everything literally into a card table in his living room and starts working on his dream, which is this men's magazine that's going to be for guys like him, urban men who don't hunt or fish, who really need to understand this whole consumer culture that is erupting everywhere around. It's going to be a guide how to eat strange cheese. There are articles like ricotta is not for the faint of heart, which is funnily enough what I thought ricotta was for, but I guess not in 1954, right? How to buy a high five. And best of all, there would be some nude shots. But these would be classy nude shots, and they wouldn't be women who were sleazy or scary, which a lot of that kind of stuff was. And there was a lot of it around at the time. The result was, of course, Playboy magazine, which was an instant success. And at its core was something I think was essentially Chicago. Unlike New York, where your value is based in no small part on things you can do that other people can't. Chicago still had this urge to be the convention host, to get everybody into the party. And Hef wanted everybody in, whether it was through the magazine, the TV show, or the Playboy clubs. There's one, Playboy Penthouse, if you ever see this cut is not online, but everyone, they had a set to look like Hef's swanky, cool apartment, and they were pouring real booze during the show, so everything is getting a little tippy at a certain point. And on one, the music was great. Tony Bennett, Ella Fitzgerald, really great talent and big doe-eyed women, and Lenny Bruce popping champagne bottles is pretty funny. And one episode, Tony Bennett is singing Chicago, and he doesn't really know the words, but he's singing it. And behind him, like in the background, is Hef, and he's so thrilled. He's literally bouncing up and down on his seat. And at the end of the show, he's beaming. It's like everybody's watching, and women are walking around with platters of pizza, which is exotic. And he takes a little slice of pizza. Then he looks at the camera, and I paraphrase what he said. He said, "I really wish I could share this pizza with you, but I can't stuff it through the video screen." And it's just that was Hef. He wanted everybody to be in there. He didn't invent sex. He wasn't the first to talk about sex. He wasn't the first to publish nude pictures, but he forced it into the mainstream conversation after the decades of the Depression and the war had kind of demonized sex. In the 20s, it was a lot different than it was in the 30s and 40s, and it was actually going back to the 20s that Hef did more. For better or worse, the hypersexuality of American culture, I think you can say, begins with Hefner. There are many, 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 many more names to talk about. Richard J. Daley, Henry Darger, the outsider painter, the public housing pioneer Elizabeth Wood, Vivian Meyer, the photographer who was a nanny 6 days a week and a great street photographer the other day, Lorraine Hansberry, Gwendolyn Brooks, probably the most underrated poet, I think, of the century, but I may have already overwhelmed you, so I will leave some of that for you in the book. To close, let me say that understanding America, I think, requires understanding Chicago. The pilot issue of Chicago Magazine in 1953 said, "Subtract what Chicago has given to it, and you wouldn't recognize America." Whether or not you'd like what you would see would be another question. America without McDonald's or centerfolds or cold, awful skyscrapers would also be an America without Frank Lloyd Wright or regional theater or a labor movement. All of these things are uniquely American precisely because they came out of a city that I think most genuinely expresses America as a whole. And restoring Chicago to its central place in American history is, I think, a crucial step towards reassembling our national shared sense of identity and experience. Thank you. Now I'll put my glasses on so I can see people. So questions, happy to answer.
So you've done a really good job of telling the what of Chicago, or anyway, your version of the what, and it sucked me in. But you haven't said anything about the why, other than you had to land there or stop there, going coast to coast, so it got lots of visitors. And
Well,
of
there
course,
were
it
more
was
than,
the
you
second
know-
biggest city in America at the time. But is there any more to the why? I mean, anything like having to do maybe with its hinterland or with its political governance or whatever why you might come up
Well,
with?
that geographical, those visitors were more than just visitors. That was basically everything going through the country was going through there, you know, and so it was a kind of clearinghouse. You know, you literally couldn't get there without going through there somehow. It was a central point for America. I mean, it's hard to know what other why. It was the manufacturing center of America. You know, all these things were coming out of this place. So it's hard to picture now, 60 years later, the kind of role it had. I mean, it had grown up out of the prairie as this kind of surprise. You know, it was almost a marvel in American eyes of what exactly this city was. It had grown up out of. And it, unlike Boston or unlike Philadelphia, which kind of had their own identities, their own groups of people who had started it for reasons other than, you know, religion or something. Chicago was there for business. New York money had planted it there, and it was part of the extension of America in a certain way. And it was crucial. The farms would, there's a wonderful book, William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, which is kind of a touchstone for me, certainly. American agriculture wouldn't have existed without the kind of spread that Chicago was able to do and create the railroad system that did it. You know, the idea of what Kroc does, Ray Kroc, is kind of the end of a process. You know, Chicago, the whole idea of the commodities future is invented there. In the old days, if you bought a bushel of corn from someone, you would literally buy the bushel of corn. But as the volume of growth increases, they create the grain elevator. And the idea of you buying, they grade the wheat so that suddenly you buy, all right, I'm going to pour it all in there. I'm going to get paid. And when I buy it, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to trust you that what you're going to give me is this certain grade of corn. And suddenly the transaction's different. You know, and this is all part, you know, you're buying the concept of corn instead of the thing itself. And these are all part of what Chicago has done over its history. And it was a surprising place and considered a treacherous place. It was a legendary place. And this is before you even get to here, you know. So it had a remarkable place in Chicago, in the national imagination that I think it doesn't have now. You know, and part of that is, part of that was simply the expansion of the loss of manufacturing, the flights going over, and kind of the introduction of L.A. and New York as being their own little bubble over it all. But and much of it were things that Chicago did to itself. You know, and it kind of saved itself by killing itself. The way it dealt with race and integration was devastating. So, you know, the why is in so many details in so many different areas that it's hard to say, well, it's because it's centrality. The fact that it was able to mediate between the rural and the urban. This was the manufacturing center of America, but it was also the agricultural center in certain ways. You know, it made farming, like I said, farming possible, but there were millions of cattle in there any day of the week. You know, as I was a kid, I remember still, I can remember the smell of it. You know, it was remarkable. So farms were even a part of what Chicago was about, which I don't think you can say about New York. The Grand Ole Opry was based on a radio show out of Chicago called Barn Dance. So even country music is something that was kind of a product in some way or spread by Chicago. And so that's a little bit of what I tried to bottle in there.
Sure.
Yeah, I was born and raised in Chicago, went to school in Chicago,
What part?
West Side.
West Side, okay.
The question I have is, could you tell us a little about your connection with Chicago and why you selected the term the Third Coast rather than the Second City?
Well, my connection is that I was born there, and my parents were born there, and I sort of go back 3 generations, and my grandfather worked in slaughterhouses and was the waiter at the Edgewater Beach Hotel. The other one made pipes at Chicago Faucet. So, you know, we're kind of deep in there. And I left to go to college in New York when I was 18, but you know, Chicago, as I said to somebody, you know, I think people like Mark and I, we're not expatriates or exiles, we're exports. We kind of bring Chicago with us wherever we go in that way. You know, when I wanted to go into doing some more nonfiction, naturally went back there because it's a place I know, and I know what the streets mean, and I, have those thoughts and memories. And you can understand the connotations. It can be hard to write about a place where you have to get all that from scratch, right? So I started diving in here, and I've been reading all these books, and many of them I'd been reading over the years because I love the place, right? And there were so many. There were great definitive books on Algren. There's a great book on Kroc. There's all these definitive books. But what I hadn't found was any of them really creating a context. And when I sat down and said, well, gee, in 1955, this happens. Well, wait, in 1955, this happens. And wait, these songs are recorded. And wait, there's Emmett Till. All these things are going on around each other, next to each other. These people know each other. There's a whole web of connections. And so even if they weren't all connected, they were happening at the same time and place. And that's worth looking at. And this book has been done for New York at various times. It's been done, City of Nets. It's been done A Nervous Splendor, which was a book that was a real influence on me by, you should have that in the store, by Frederick Morton, which is a terrific book about fin de siècle Vienna, where you have Brahms and Bruckner and Klimt and Freud and Jung. All these people are kind of the makers of the modern century, of the meaning of modern, are all there at the same time. And so what does that mean, and why did that happen? And so for me, these are the people who created, in some ways, the American century, as Luce would call it, that second half of American ascendant power, whether it's rock and roll, whether it's McDonald's, all these different things that are seminal to the American experience are happening there together. And so that's what I wanted to put my hand around. The title came from my genius agent, who said, why don't you call it The Third Coast? And that just was like a little tuning fork that had kind of exactly the right sound to me. So I did use that title, and then I did get an email 2 days ago from another man who had titled his book The Third Coast, saying, thank you for using my title. And then he said, well, my sales have never been higher on Amazon. And there's no emoticon for saying just how snarky or actually grateful he was. But if anyone has any ideas on how I should respond, please let me know, because I haven't quite crafted my response yet. But good for him. I'm thinking it's a win-win for us all. Exactly. Good for you. But happily, I was going to say, actually, I borrowed the title from the man who wrote the book about Atlanta hip-hop called The Third Coast. But I think you get that. Anyway. Yes, sir.
I'm very impressed with your depth of knowledge about Chicago. And so I'd be interested in your opinion, looking back at racial politics in Chicago, and you have Oscar DePriest, the first African-American in the United States Congress in the modern era, and then followed by Congressman Dawson. And then you have this kind of retrograde Richard J. Daley
It's
years.
Daley, yeah.
I'm not saying Richard J. Daley necessarily the person, but those years in which Chicago was really bringing the civil rights movement down rather than
Enormously,
progressive.
yeah. I mean, it's very, and it's, listen, I've kind of given you this is a kind of greatest hits, it's the fun stuff, but going on at the same time, there really is a virtual, as Elizabeth would call it, a virtual guerrilla war going on in Chicago for housing. There are something like 400 violent racial incidents in Chicago in about a 6-year period in the early 40s. I mean, it is, any of which would be on the front page of a newspaper. It's a daily occurrence in Chicago during these periods. I mean, the way I look at it is that people kind of moved from looking at the maps of the European theater and then started to look at the maps of Chicago and bring the same kind of language to it. Invasions and breaching things. I mean, I grew up with this still kind of mindset going into the 60s. One of the issues, though, and also in here, is the black community in Chicago is very complicated because there's this old settler group who had lived in small community, black community in Chicago that had kind of gone under the radar. And then when the migrations, and they were, Episcopal, kind of old school African Methodist, conservative. And when you get this huge influx, it comes up starting in the teens, and then again with, all the way through the war years, all the kind of stuff that's in Isabel Wilkerson's book, it creates incredible tension in Chicago. And some of that tension, Mahalia Jackson and those blues people and the way the music plays out actually exemplifies that. There's a huge amount of conflict between those two groups, and that exerts itself politically because there is no kind of single political leadership in any way or form. There's a lot of different places it goes. So the kind of the more established black community that is kind of more interested in commercial issues and sort of putting down their bucket basically, and are happy to do that, make accommodations more quickly with the city government. And Bill Dawson is somebody who is kind of very happy to bundle up people's votes in exchange for favors and things like that. And Daley is then able to kind of circumvent him and undermine him by basically addressing people's concerns by putting together blue ribbon panels of people who are really thrilled to be on the blue ribbon panel, and that's about it, you know. And he creates a way to really destroy Dawson's power base, to destroy the NAACP's power base in Chicago, and really co-opt black leadership in Chicago. The fascinating thing about Daley in '55 is that his big constituencies are the really extremely racist wards of Chicago and the black community. The two people who absolutely cannot stand each other are the two groups that put Daley into power. And he did no favors, actually, at the end of the day, for either side. So the racial politics in here drive an enormous amount of what happens. So it's kind of the background to a lot of, I think, the creative tension that's going on in the city at the time. Whoops, again.
Hey, Tom, one of the things I really liked about the book is that the things you mentioned, all of these things happening at the same time, but there are a few times in the book where these things either run in harmony with each other or kind of run smack up against each other. I'm thinking of Gwendolyn Brooks writing about her housing project, and then Mies van der Rohe planning the demolition of that housing
Right. I mean, it actually
project at
speaks
that same
to
time.
right. It speaks to what the last guy was saying about kind of racial politics. Is that, you know, there was a map here. There was a big apartment building built around 1890s for the fair called the Mecca, and it was about 34th and State Street, which is right by, at that time, the heart of Black Chicago, called Bronzeville. It was kind of loosely called, and it was very fancy at the beginning, and then as time went by, it kind of slipped and became more of a working class place. But as IIT and a lot of the big urban renewal things that were going on, certainly IIT wanted to expand. If they were going to stay in the city and have Mies build this great campus, they were going to expand. So they kept wanting to buy up things, and right smack in the middle was this big apartment complex called the Mecca, which they kept trying to buy and eventually did, but they weren't allowed to get rid of the people in it. And this was a very almost legendary place in Chicago. There were blues songs written about it. It was a real kind of, you know, it had a lot of symbolic import in Black Chicago. So IIT kind of, they're not able to tear it down during World War II because there's a terrible housing shortage. Gwendolyn Brooks, the poet, actually works there for a while. And it's her first, because she's an old settler, part of that kind of conservative black community, and she's kind of brought face to face with what migrant Black Chicago looks like. After the war, IIT's finally able to tear down, they run it into the ground, and as eminent domain things kind of go, they turn it into a slum, and then they say, ooh, look, it's a slum. Can we turn it down now? So they tear it down, and Mies builds, like Mark said, probably maybe his greatest building, Crown Hall, which is this very spare, massive space. Mies used to say, I manufacture space, which is what he did in this building. He just kind of just creates a shell, and I was just there not long ago. Huge just room, and it's so simple. But you walk in there and think, well, why didn't anybody think of this before? It's just this grand, big box of space. But it is literally on top of the Mecca. And it ends up being, I think, a kind of imperial statement of triumph. You know, we finally settled this whole Black South Side thing, so let's pop this beautiful building on it. And Gwendolyn Brooks writes, I would say, her greatest poem, a kind of epic called In the Mecca, about a young girl who is abducted, and she goes kind of from apartment to apartment, introducing the people of the Mecca. And so you have one of Mies's greatest buildings and Gwendolyn Brooks's maybe greatest poem, both about the same half acre of Chicago. I just found that remarkable. Yeah.
Pardon me. When I think of Chicago, the first thing that comes to my mind is Al Capone in Chicago,
Right.
and I'm sure you probably get that
I've heard that
very
yeah.
often.
Yeah.
Could you speak to that a little bit about Chicago and Prohibition and popular imagination, popular culture, and also the importance of sports, particularly baseball? The importance of sports, just briefly.
Well, then let's all take it. Whoa, yeah, it's going to be a long chat on that one. You know, the mob stuff I really kind of how to get to that, and here, this is post that whole Al Capone, Tommy guns in the street kind of thing. And a lot of what has happened by now is some of the really big names who were big mobsters have begun to go legit as it happens. At a certain point, you're not, you could get the booze, so they went into other things. There was one, the Crowns, Henry Crown, General Building, they owned all building materials in Chicago, which seems like a good business deal to own all the building materials into the second largest city in the country. Somehow they were able to do that. He later bought the Empire State Building and then went into General Dynamics. So, I mean, there was some sense that maybe all of his money was not legit. And there were a lot of people like that who kind of by this point have gone there. The other thing that happens, though, is in the 50s, early 50s, Estes Kefauver starts the big crime commission. He's going to stamp out crime all over. So he starts this kind of wave of public things. And as they come closer and closer to Chicago, the Sam Giancana, Tony Accardo, the big mobsters at the time, kind of say, you know what, fine. We're going to, places like the Macamba Lounge, which is a bar that was owned by the Chess brothers, mysteriously go up in flames all over the city. Just a rash of fires, right? And so the place that a lot of the mobsters go, where they're going to take a lot of their business, is out in the desert to a place called Las Vegas. And that is actually a development that has a big impact on Chicago, because that suddenly becomes the place where if you want to see the singers and go to the floor shows and see the dancers in the strip, like that's where you're going. And so Chicago loses some of its kind of loche edge when that happens, because it was really an open town for a long, long, long time. And it actually is one of the things that opens up for Daley, because Kefauver comes to town, and there's some sense, rumors possibly, that he had been caught, as they say, in flagrante, even though he was supposed to be, milk drinking kind of guy. And so he says, okay, I'm actually not going to go after all the mobsters, but we'll have these kind of show hearings. And the candidate for sheriff, the Democratic candidate for sheriff, is a guy named Daniel Tubbo Gilbert, who is just supposed to be one of the great doughheads of history. And he volunteers to go to these hearings, and everyone says, no, please don't go. But he goes, and they say, gee, why do you have this $200,000 in your bank account? And he, the sheriff, ostensibly of the county, says, gambling, which is, of course, illegal. So the whole Democratic ticket goes right down the toilet, which basically opens the door for Richard J. Daley's kind of emergence in Cook County. So the other two big kind of mob guys who are involved, the Korshak family, which is, in some ways connected. So that Marshall Korshak in Chicago and Sidney Korshak, who goes to L.A. and becomes a major player in pretty much everything that happens in L.A. So the mob becomes... It's still there, certainly, and it goes under until Daley emerges. One of the first thing he does early in his tenure in 55 is get rid of the commission, the special police group that goes after the mob, saying, you just can't really stop them, basically, and kind of opens the door and creates that business nexus for it, so that suddenly everybody is in on the take. And so if you want to open that restaurant, if you don't use this guy's linens, the fire inspector may need to come, and you'll suddenly find that they're coming every week or so. And so it was, there wasn't shooting in the streets, but it ended up being a real damper on business. I mean, it literally was. The day-to-day functioning became kind of onerous because everybody got balled up together in it. So I think that's where the mob goes in this. I mean, I didn't play it too strong in that way. Baseball in Chicago, oh, must we? It's it is a sad thing. Our school was about 2 miles away. Did you ever cut school to go to a game? No. They would actually. I do remember this on opening day. If you were absent, they would call your house. You might not.
Which game was that?
That was the Cubs, Wrigley Field. That's. I think you should probably stop right there. Gordon Tech, California Edison. It's depressing, and it's not getting any better. I think it's getting significantly worse, and I don't know what to say about that. I've raised 2 kids, my son, who is now 18, during the glory days of the Yankees, the Jeter or Williams years, all that kind of stuff. And so at a certain point, he was like, Dad, I'll do the Bears. I can do that. I like that, but this, why are you making me think about the Cubs when I've got Derek Jeter? And it got hard to argue that point. So I have relented on that, and the Cubs are still a kind of sick vice at this point. There's nothing other than sick to it. So
Thank you. I look forward to reading
great,
the book.
thanks. I hope you do. Anything else? Happy to. No. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and please, if you want, books are in the front of the store.